All right. So number one says the graph below shows ocean tide height in feet over a 44-hour period for a coastal location in the northeastern United States. The dots represent either high or low tide. So the dots represent either high tides or low tides. And so the question says, if the pattern continued, the next low tide occurring on day 3 at approximately what? All right. So one thing to just keep in mind, this is a high tide, right? This is a low tide, right? This is also a high tide. This is also a high tide. And even here is also a high tide as well. All right. Down here, the low points, these all represents low tides, okay? So the question is asking if the pattern continued, right? When will the next low tide occur on day 3? So let's look at the last low tide, right? Let's look at the last low tide. So the last low tide occurred right here. And when I'm looking at the time, it looks to be about 1 p.m. That was the last low tide. That was the last low tide. All right. So when will the next low tide occur? Well, remember in our notes, if we take a look at our notes, let me change the color. It says, right, to go from a low tide to the next low tide, it takes a little over 12 hours. So about 12 hours and 25 minutes. So that lets me know 12 hours and 25 minutes later will be the next low tide. So if I go back, let me erase all this other stuff, right? If the last low tide occurred at 1 p.m., 12 hours and 25 minutes later, right? It would end up being 1:25 a.m. All right. Because remember, each low tide occurs every 12 hours and about 25 minutes. So when I'm looking, which option is close to 1:25 a.m.? And the correct answer is choice 2. All right. Keep in mind, every low tide occurs every 12 hours and 25 minutes. So if the last one occurred at 1 p.m., 12 hours and 25 minutes later, the next one will occur at 1:25 a.m. And the best option is choice 2. All right, number 3. It says, base your answer to the following question on the diagram below and on your knowledge of Earth science. The diagram represents the moon at different positions labeled A, B, C, and D in its orbit around Earth. At which 2 moon positions, right? So it gives us the diagram. The sun is here, right? This is where the sun is, right? So at which 2 moon positions would an observer on Earth most likely experience the highest high tides and the lowest low tides? Okay, well, what do we know about what type of tides experience the highest high tides and the lowest low tides? Well, if we take a look at our notes, right? The type of tides that experience the highest high tides, right? High tides are very high and low tides are very low, right? High tides are very high, low tides are very low. This occurs during a spring tide, okay? And when do we get spring tides? We get it during a full moon and we get it during a new moon. So pretty much when the sun, the moon, and the earth are directly aligned, right? It's a direct horizontal line. All right, this is the earth. When it's a direct horizontal line, right, between the sun, the moon, and the earth, that is when you get the highest high tides and the lowest low tides. So therefore, if I go back, let me just clear this out. So if we know the highest high tides and the lowest low tides occur when the sun, the earth, and the moon are directly aligned with each other, that means it's going to be position C and A. Why? Because they're directly aligned with each other, right? The sun is directly horizontal of the moon and the earth. So that's why the correct answer is choice 3. Once again, when they experience the highest high tides and the lowest low tides, that occurs during a spring tide. And when we look at our notes, the last time that we've seen a spring tide only occurs during a full moon and a new moon, when the sun, the moon, and the earth are directly aligned with each other, directly horizontal. So once again, the correct answer is choice 3. All right, let's take a look at number 5. Number 5 says the table below color shows the time of ocean's high tides and low tides on a certain date at a New York State location. So they tell us the high tide occurs at 4:45 a.m., a low tide occurs at 10:58 a.m., another high tide occurs at 5:15 p.m., and a low tide occurs at 11:22 p.m. And so the question asks, approximately what time on the following day did the next high tide occur at this location? So when did the next high tide occur? Okay. Well, we know to go from a high tide to another high tide, how long does it take, everybody? It takes, let's take a look at our notes. If we go to our notes, if we take a look, and right here, all right, let me just clear this out the way. It says it right here. To go from a high tide to the next high tide, it takes 12 hours and 25 minutes, about that, all right? It takes 12 hours and 25 minutes. So therefore, when I'm going back, all right, remember that we said to go from a high tide to the next high tide is going to be 12 hours and 25 minutes, all right? So if the last high tide was 5:15, 12 hours and 25 minutes later will end up being 5:40 a.m., right? Because 12 hours later would make it 5 a.m. And then 25 minutes later would 15 plus 25 would give you 5:40. So the correct answer is 5:40 a.m. Simply because when you go from a high tide to another high tide, it takes 12 hours and 25 minutes. All right, number 8. Number 8 says the graph, base your answers, base your answers to questions 8 and 10 on the graph below and on your knowledge of earth science. The graph shows the tidal range, the difference between the highest tide and the lowest tide, recorded in Millis Basin, Nova Scotia, during November 2007. The phase of the moon on selected days is shown above the graph. The days that the moon was farthest from Earth, apogee, and closest to Earth, perigee, are indicated under the graph. All right, so they give us the graph and they give us the different tide heights, all right, throughout the month. So question 8 says the next first quarter moon after November 17th occurs closest to what? Well, we learned how long does it take for a cycle to repeat itself? Let's see. Let's scroll back to our notes. And right here, right? So we know to complete one lunar cycle of phases, it'll take 29.5 days, almost an entire month, pretty much. All right, almost an entire month. So when we go back, we know that the next quarter phase, the next first quarter moon phase, will occur 29.5 days later. All right, after November 17th. So 29.5 days later will end up giving you either December 17th or December 16th, one of the two, for 29.5 days later, one of the two options. And so when I look, the best answer is choice 3. Remember that a moon phase repeats itself every 29.5 days, just about a month, right? And since there's only 30 days in November, usually we can go from the November 17th to December 17th. So choice 3 is your answer. Number 9, right? It says the highest high tides and the lowest low tides occur when the moon was near what? All right. So when I'm looking on my graph, where do I see the highest high tide? So I'm not looking for just the high tide. I'm looking for the highest high tide. So when I'm looking, I see the highest value would be right here for the highest high tide. Highest high tide. And the lowest low tide looks to be right here. All right, looks to be right here. So I'm going to say this is the lowest low tide. So where is it near, right? Where I see the highest high tide and the lowest low tide, it looks to be about November 25th. And what two things that I see? I see it's close to a full moon and it's close to perigee. So the correct answer has to be the option that has a full moon and perigee, because that's on the graph. That's why I see the highest high tide and the lowest low tide. And so the correct answer ends up being, oops, let me erase all this other stuff. The correct answer ends up being perigee and full moon, choice 4. Choice 4. Number 10. Number 10 says the tidal range on November 8th was approximately what, right? The tidal range. So when we're talking about the range, we're talking about the difference between the low point and the highest point. So when I zoom in, November 8 is right here. And when November 8 is the highest, it looks to be 13 meters. When November 8 is the lowest, it looks to be 2 meters, right? So when it's the highest, it was 13 meters. And when it was the lowest, it was 2 meters. The range tells us that we need the difference between the high point and the low point. And so therefore, the correct answer is 11 meters, which ends up being choice 1. Number 11. It says the photographs below shows the same coastal location at 2 different times during the same day. Which statement best explains the cause for the higher water level at 6:52 p.m.? So why is it that on one time of the day, right, the water level could be very low, right? Well, the tide, right, could be really low. And then at 6:52, your tide could be really high, right? When we're talking about the tide, we're pretty much talking about the water level. Okay? So let's see, what is the reason why we have tides? Okay, well, let's go to our notes based on what we've learned. And if we go to our notes, let's take a look. Let's take a look. All right, here we go. We have to go to the main reason. What causes Earth's tides, right? And what causes Earth's tides is the gravitational pull of the moon and the gravitational pull of the sun, right? However, of course, the gravitational pull of the moon has a greater influence, right? It has a greater influence, right? So we are definitely focusing on the gravitational pull of the moon. So which option shows that? Which option shows where the moon gravitational pull is the reason for us having these very high tides and low tides, the increasing and decreasing of water level? The correct answer is choice 2. The moon exerts a gravitational pull on a rotating Earth. All right, and that's the reason why we have 2 different tides, right, throughout the day.